Well, hello, Master Gardener trainee. We're going to be talking about coping with drought in the landscape. It sounds kind of funny that we're talking about drought when most of the time when we're doing Master Gardener training, we do it during our rainy season. But inevitably, we dry out at some point in the fall and usually in the spring as well. Let's go back to shortly after I started an extension in late 1999. Here's the U.S. Drought Monitor. We'll be seeing several of these slides. Notice how Florida was abnormally dry in December. Now, the rainy season just finished up only a couple of months earlier, so sometimes we get these wintertime drought periods before we get cold fronts to bring down rainy weather from the north. And you can see by the spring of a year later, we were in quite a bit of drought at the extreme to exceptional. Notice how the western part of the United States was doing fairly well. And here we were again in 2001. The spring of 2001 was one of the hottest, driest springs that I can remember, and we've been in drought for now about a year and a half, and conditions were getting worse. This is where water restrictions in at least Pasco County were tightened up over what SwiftMud, the Southwest Florida Water Management District, mandates as a maximum amount of water. We currently have once a week watering restriction for any potable water body, whether you're on a well, whether it's a municipal water source or something like that. And by 2000 in December, Christmas time, we were still getting droughty, but it was starting to get better. We had a reasonably decent rainy season in 2001. And then in 2002, we were doing pretty well a year later. Notice the western half of the country is starting to get pretty dry. And we can see it persisted for several years out west in 2003, as you can see by these maps. And in 2004, it kept on persisting. What's interesting is the West Coast can be in years of drought, where Florida generally doesn't go much more than a season or two in drought conditions. And here is 2007, and you can see California has been hurting for quite a number of years at the time of this recording. And here we are in 2014, and it was really cranking up. California has been in a serious drought for roughly a decade and so. And it continues to remain pretty bad in 15, 16, late 16. Notice we had a little bit of drought in 16 there. And again, here we had a bit of drought in Florida for a while in May of 2017. How quickly we forget, Master Gardeners. Notice California had a pretty good snowpack over winter time in 2017, but drought has since quickly returned back to California. And we can see one of the more recent amounts of drought. The quest for water. Makes a lot of headlines, and this was, again, that drought conditions of 2001, one of the worst droughts I've seen in Florida in my many, many years of living here. It even makes a cover of various newspaper inserts. Will we run out of water? Now, of course, the water gets recycled over and over again, but a lot of it is either polluted, frozen in the polar caps, where it's inaccessible to us, at least currently, or it's salt water. And one of the big problems with Florida being on a peninsula surrounded by saltwater is saltwater intrusion, especially if we overpump. This is why we have water restrictions to reduce that potentiality. So it begs the question, why do we have frequent droughts in Florida? Let's think about this for a moment. Well, we have a rainy season, right? Usually starts in June and ends in late August some years, but usually sometime in September when it gets a little wonky, and by about October we're out of the rainy season. So why do we have back and forth of drought and then rainy season? Well, let's look at the map of the world. Point out to point, Find Florida first of all on this map, and you can see it's kind of on the left hand side of the screen more so. And now take your finger and go right across without moving your finger up or down, but go right across the Atlantic Ocean and end up in the first continent that we see. You're in Africa. Notice the color is a lightish tan. And what kind of conditions do they have at that latitude? You're right. It is desert. And if you go across, you get to Iran and Iraq, etc., etc. And of course, you have the other deserts over in Asia. And then you go around the world and you come over to Baja California area, which is on the same latitude as we are. And again, they have distinct dry conditions that most of the deserts of the northern hemisphere are. So Florida is located at the same latitude as the deserts of the northern hemisphere. Think about the soil conditions of the desert. What is it? It's sand. What do most of us deal with in central Florida for soil? Usually sand, although some of you may have clay. But again, the point I'm trying to make is it's because we're sandwiched between two large bodies of water, the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico, is why we have a distinct rainy season. If we weren't sandwiched between those two bodies of water, we wouldn't have the heating of the land during the day in the summer, and then that would cause the lift of the warm, moist air, and we would not have a rainy season. What affects water use in the landscape? Some of them are uncontrollable factors beyond what we can do. Obviously, temperature. Not much we can do to moderate it outside. A little bit of shade or something, but that's about all you can really do with temperature. Precipitation. Obviously, when it rains around here, it pours. Wind. We don't think of wind in drought, but if some of these days can be very, very warm. The dew points are kind of low a lot of times in the spring, and that can do a lot of drying out of plant materials with just the wind and the high intensity of the sun. Speaking of sun, where we are on the planet, we get quite intense sun, especially during some of our hottest, driest months, which is usually April and May into early June. Soil texture. We can improve the soil. Generally, we don't do it except for more short-term crops like vegetables. But again, our soil texture is not much we can do about it. Most of us have to deal with sand. Drainage. Again, usually sand drains every excess bit of moisture away in a matter of moments. Water quality. Well, generally speaking, our water quality is very high in Florida. Even with reclaimed water, it's pretty darn good. Controllable factors, obviously plant choices. You can choose plants that are more drought tolerant. Some of those will be native plants. Some of those will be exotic. Right plant in the right place. Plant placement has a lot to do with drought tolerance. You may not think about that at first, but think about it for a second. How are most plants planted in our landscapes, especially if it's done by a contractor? Usually the plants are spaced about 3 feet away from the house and planted about 3 feet apart. That's an extremely high dense planting. Obviously that's going to take more water to maintain all those plants in that limited amount of area. Maintenance practices. A lot of people like to do things to their plants when it's probably best to leave them alone. A good example is during drought, a lot of people start pruning or fertilizing and telling the plant grow more. Obviously, we can control irrigation, how we apply it, how efficiently we apply it, and how often we apply it. Of course, we do have restrictions that need to be heeded. Soil structure. We can improve it. Most of the time around our landscape plants, the best way to improve it is to use mulch that came from a plant, whether it's leaves, shredded bark, or something like that. Mulching, again, it maintains the cooler soil, maintains the moisture in the soil, but also breaks down to improve the soil structure over time. Education, this is the name of our game, is what we do in extension. A lot of times people get over-reliant on watering once a week, twice a week, or whatever, and not conditioning those plants to do better on less. And then there's tolerances. It never ceases to amaze me how many people want an emerald green lawn during drought times. They want that. You don't need it. We need water to run the toilet and the dishwasher and all that kind of stuff and take a shower. So, what can you do during periods of drought? Obviously, you want to prioritize those areas that receive the water. Good example would be like an entrance to a subdivision. If it's planted with many colorful annuals, you want that to remain attractive. So those highly visible areas would be of high priority in a, in a community. This high priority may be your vegetable garden. High priority may be containers around the house or hanging baskets or something like that. Also, you want to target those drought-sensitive plants. If we remember back to some of our other modules, we're the root system of most of our trees and shrubs. If the trees and shrubs were planted properly, those root systems should extend 2 to 3 times the diameter of the top. And if they do, there's a large area to harvest water. So usually things that are drought sensitive, that don't have big root systems, they're either herbaceous like impatiens, patient lucies, or for that matter, they are things like some of our turf grasses. St. Augustine grass will need supplemental irrigation during periods of drought in order to survive. Fertilizer. What does fertilizer tell the plant to do, especially if it has high nitrogen? Which one of those 3 big numbers up there is a nitrogen? That's right, 16. Now that's not excessively high, and we know how to calculate it to get 1 pound of the actual element per 1,000 square feet now. So that's not bad, but again, that's telling the plant with relatively more nitrogen to phosphorus, the last number, the 8, to start putting out a lot of soft succulent green growth. So best thing to do during periods of drought is to avoid high nitrogen fertilizers, or for that matter, just fertilization in general. Plants won't drop over dead overnight for lack of fertilizer. They do drop over dead overnight when you over-fertilize, or they're being pushed to grow when they don't have adequate water. So a lot of times during drought periods, lots of lawns start to lose some of the color. It's okay, as long as they're alive, but most of the people want to go out there and turn it bright green again. Again, I usually recommend to hold off until the summer rains return reliably. Other things to do during drought management is to remove weak plants. These could be shrubs that aren't doing well. It could be a tree that is a danger, for example, on the photographs there, all hollow inside. If the beds are planted really thickly, again, all those shrubs planted 3 feet apart, maybe every other one is best removed because they're not doing real well anyhow. So this will reduce the competition amongst the plants and also for the water. Avoid pruning during drought because it stimulates growth. We remember this graphic, I think, from the pruning modules. But again, a lot of people go out there and start whacking plants back. And when they get cut like that, those cut areas lose water. And it also makes the plant use water, more water, to seal those areas off. So it's best to avoid any heavy-duty pruning during drought periods. A little snip here or a little clip there is one thing, but going how shall we say here, hog wild, is another. Now, this is something that the fact sheets from the University of Florida talk about, don't go into much detail, and personally, I would never recommend doing this. We don't get into drought periods that are so bad or so extended, like California or the West Coast, that I would ever recommend pruning a plant totally all the way back just as a emergency stopgap measure because there isn't enough moisture. Again, I would think to possibly water that one particular plant versus doing that kind of damage and harm to it. Pest management. A lot of plants get stressed out during drought, and a lot of insects will hone in on that, and mites as well. In the photograph there, you can see the fine silk-like webbing down there. That's spider mites. The fact there's quite a bit of webbing on the tips of those branches indicates that's been going on for a little bit of time to me. But again, these insects or mites are sucking out the fluids or juices of the plant, causing the plant to use more moisture. So it'd be best to target a spray to those plants that are under attack, whether it's a soapy water spray solution, neem oil, or a least toxic option first. So watch out for these insects and mites, and a few diseases are actually favored by dry weather, the mildews especially, and some of the vascular wilts like fusarium, etc. All of a sudden the plant looks good and the leaves start wilting and then they hold on to the stem and they're all brown and crinkly. That's usually some kind of a vascular wilt disease. Also, keep weeds under control. Not really a pest per se like insects, but again, weeds are competing for water and nutrients as well. So go out there and do a good weeding of the beds if it's awfully dry out there. Let's conclude part one of coping with drought in the landscape. Join me soon for part two.